On June 23rd, you get to decide the UK's future in Europe. Will you vote to remain in the EU or leave? For the next 60 minutes, I'll present the issues facing both sides of the argument to a panel of invited guests and a live studio audience. I'm Nick Ferrari. Welcome to the Express EU debate. Hello and welcome to the Northern and Shell building in London, home to Express newspapers and the venue for this Express EU debate. So here we are, just 20 days away from the most important decision facing the nation in decades. On the face of it, it is a simple choice. Do you want to remain in the European Union or leave? Business as usual or a Brexit? The polls for in and out are neck and neck, but many of you are undecided and turning regularly to the pages of the Daily Express, the Sunday Express, the Daily Star and the Star on Sunday for all the information you need. But here for the next 60 minutes, let's look at some of the major issues surrounding this historic referendum and how they affect you. Our live audience is made up of an equal number of Remain, of Leave and Don't Knows. To help you make up your mind, or possibly change it, let's welcome our Express EU debate panel. To the Remain side, Chuka Umunna has been the Labour MP for Streatham since 2012. He was Shadow Secretary of State for Business, Innovation and Skills from 2011 until 2015, and he entered the Labour Party leadership race in 2015 but later withdrew his candidacy. He's argued the benefits of free trade are one of the advantages of the UK staying in the EU. Let's hear it for Chuka, please, ladies and gentlemen. To Chuka's left, Siobhan McDonough has been the Labour MP for Mitcham and Morden since 1997. She's also a former assistant whip for the Labour Party. She's voting to remain in the EU to protect our trade relationship and our financial services industry. A round of applause, please, for Siobhan. Completing the Remain lineup, Richard Reid. Now, Richard is the co-founder of Innocent Drinks and Jam Jar Investments. He's the deputy chairman of the Britain Stronger in Europe campaign. Richard says he fears the UK's GDP would shrink if we were to quit the EU. A round of applause for Richard as well. And to my right, Nigel Farage. Well, if he wins the bet you read about in the Daily Express today, he'll be a rich man. He's been the leader of UKIP since 2010. Prior to that, from 2006 to 2009. He's also been an MEP since 1999. Before politics, he worked as a commodity broker. Nigel's been campaigning for the Brexit for decades. He argues particularly in favour of greater border controls. Let's hear it for Mr Farage, please. To his right, the proverbial rose, possibly between two, I'll let you finish that sentence, is Kate Hoey. Now, Kate's been the Labour MP for Vauxhall since 1989. She served as Minister for Sport under the Tony Blair government. She maintains that Euroscepticism is traditionally a left-wing movement and will vote to leave due to the crippling effect, she says, the EU has on this country. Let's hear it for Kate. And to complete the lineup, Jacob Rees-Mogg has been the Conservative MP for North East Somerset since 2010. Now, prior to politics, he worked in the City of London and he founded Somerset Capital Management. Jacob is primarily concerned by Britain's lack of sovereignty due to EU law. A round of applause, please, for the last member of our panel. As you are watching this, you can take part, and please do, online using the hashtag Express EU debate, and I'll share some of your thoughts, views and feelings with you during the course of our conversation. Now, let's start with a subject that's rarely off the front pages and really got some added attention from last night from the Prime Minister's appearance. It's immigration. Total net migration to the UK is running at over 300,000 a year, despite the government failing to hit its target of tens of thousands. Now, around half of the immigrants coming to the UK are from outside the EU. EU citizens have the right to live and work in any member state. They work here, they live here, they pay taxes here. Therefore, migrants are entitled to make use of our public services, our hospitals, our schools, our housing, etc. So if we start with you, Nigel Farage, they live here, they work here, they pay taxes here. What's the problem?
The problem is we had immigration post-war for 60 years, running at about a net 30,000 a year. It was a number that we could live with, a number that we could accept, a number that did not put exceptional strain on our public services, and a number within which government could plan for the future. What did we do in 2004? Mr. Blair opened the door to 8 and then 10 former communist countries, and we now have no control over the numbers that are coming. So we can't plan or provide for our public services, and we've got to a point now where the sheer numbers of people coming are putting intolerable strains on our public services, have driven down wages for ordinary workers. And if I just pick out one little issue just to sort of explain how tough this is, very few young people can now get on the housing ladder. They can't aspire to what their parents or grandparents had. The pressure is massive, and the population pressure is massive. We now have to build a new house, one new house every 4 minutes in this country, just to cope with current levels of immigration.
So how would coming out of the EU change that, Mr Farage?
Because at the moment we have no control, and this is where the Prime Minister got into big trouble last night. He's trying to maintain that we can control immigration numbers as members of the European Union, and we can't, because that, which ought to be a British passport, the first two words on it are European Union, and 508 million people have got one of those, and any of them can come. I want us to have a positive immigration policy. I want us to have one that says to people from all over the world, you've got skills to bring, you haven't got a criminal record, you bring your own health insurance, we're very happy to have you, but in sensible numbers. We can only do that by voting for Brexit.
And this is the Australian points system, briefly, is it?
Well, that's what they do. The Australians...
But that would lead to more people. One of the architects of the Australian points system says it would get more people into this country.
Australia is a continent, that wants more people, but they're very selective about who they have. The thing about a points system is we can choose. But what I think, post-Brexit we should do is we should actually make this something that Parliament debates, that Parliament decides on, so that at general elections every MP is accountable to their constituents for how they've spoken and how they voted on the immigration issue.
All right, thank you for that. Remember, if you want to get around, absolutely, have your applause, or if you think otherwise. More on that side in a moment. Chuka, you're an MP for an inner part of London, which will feel pressure on schools, on hospitals, on housing and everything. There must be something to what Nigel Farage is saying, surely.
Well, it's a myth to suggest that all these problems that we have in our country, whether it's school places, NHS funding, housing, is down to the fact that we have all these immigrants taking these places. It's a very convenient dumping ground of blame for domestic governments of all political persuasions. Look, the reason that people cannot get on the housing ladder in my constituency and in the SW16 postcode, we've seen house prices go up by over 20% year on year for the last 2 to 3 years, is because we haven't built enough homes. We've got the lowest rate of new build since the 1920s. And the reason that we have a problem with school places and teacher shortages is because you haven't seen enough investment in our schools and you haven't seen enough teachers being trained. Now, it's very convenient to say that's all the fault of these immigrant children, but no, it isn't. It's actually the fault of the government here. And in respect of this, can I just touch on the Australian point system, by the way? Because one of the really important things for people who are listening to this here and on camera to remember is that actually we have slightly more people coming here from outside the EU than from in the EU. Now, we already have a point system that applies to people coming in from outside the EU, but we are still getting more of those in than we are coming from in the EU. And let's not forget to look at the other side of the coin on this. We've got 2 million Brits living and working in the European Union and enjoying the free movement that brings. Yes, we have. We've got 1.5 million people employed in EU citizens-owned businesses here, and we've got over 100,000 EU citizens helping us run the very public services that you're talking about.
Let's get the numbers right. There are 1 million British people who have holiday homes in Europe. People like my father who spends February in Spain. They don't count. So there are 1 million.
I said living and working. I said living and working. 1.2 million living, and when you include people who work, it's 2 million.
A third of that million.
It's 2 million.
A third of that million are in Ireland, with whom we've had an open border for 100 years because of our historical links. And of the 750,000 who are living, they're mostly on the Costa del Sol or in the west of France, and the vast majority of them actually are retired and spending their money. So the idea that 2 million of us are living and working in Europe simply is not true.
It's 1.9. Let's get the facts straight. You can go and check this online. People watching this online, go and Google it on Fact Check. There are 1.2 million people, yes, living in the EU. When you take into account people who are living and working there, it is 2 million. That is the figure.
All right, let's not get too hung up on figures. Let's bring Kate. Kate, I heard you muttering and getting quite angry. You're on the Labour side, if you will, although you're sitting on the right, my right hand. What about this suggestion of the number of houses that need to be built and successive failures by governments of all different colour?
I think, Chuck is right that there's not been enough housing built, but that's a kind of different argument from what we're here today to discuss, because for me, there is absolutely no sense in us, unlike any other country in the world, apart from those that are in the EU, not being able to control your own borders. And the reality is we can't, because anyone who's part of the European Union can come in. And therefore, I want to see some planning going into the fact of we can't plan when we don't know how many people there are going to be.
Kate Hoey, just respond to Siobhan McDonough.
Well, I didn't hear you.
There is no country in the world that controls its own borders absolutely. Look at Donald Trump wanting to build a wall against Mexico.
Hang on. There's all talking about illegal immigration. We're talking about people who can come by right because they have got a European Union passport. And that, to me, is doing down, particularly countries in the Commonwealth that we have a huge past historical relationship with, that I would love to see more people coming from. No one. And it's this sort of media, I'm not going to blame the media because we're here in a newspaper.
No, don't worry.
There is this argument always that anyone who's against the EU is somehow against immigration. We all know that immigration is going to happen and is needed. It's the kind of immigration, the people we want with skills. The Australian points system, to me, seems a really common sense, sensible approach to how we control the numbers. It's so obvious.
But hang on, if you had that point system in respect of EU immigration, you could actually end up with more people coming in. The Australians have double the amount of immigration per head.
It's an
they get double the amount of immigration per head as we do.
Because they choose to do so.
Yeah, we would be choosing differently. We would be deciding.
One at a time, Kate. Nigel Farage in a sentence.
Yeah, Australia chooses how many people it wants, and it does it every year. It does it clinically. It looks sector by sector at who they need to build their economy.
And the people of Australia support it.
More people coming in.
No, it does not, because they choose. And what we're going to have post-Brexit is people like you voting on it in the House of Commons.
All right, let's bring Jacob Rees-Mogg in. Mr. Rees-Mogg, you are the representative of the party of the Prime Minister who appeared yesterday on that debate, and he said the way to control this immigration problem is to stay within the EU. Was your Prime Minister right?
No, he wasn't. He's wrong. And frankly, it's embarrassing to have stood on an election manifesto that said we would bring immigration down to the tens of thousands when we can't unless we leave the European Union. And the numbers may be much higher than the ONS is telling us, because when you look at the number of national insurance numbers issued, it was 610,000, so more than double the number that the ONS was recording. The Prime Minister admitted to 1.2 million people coming in from the European Union in his term as Prime Minister. And that is where we get the pressure for houses, because you have 1.2 million people coming in, you need what? 500, 600,000 more houses to be built. That's 2 years of the housing supply out of the 6 years that we've been in office.
So why is he so wide of the mark, Mr. Rees-Mogg?
Why is he so wide of the mark? Because he's set his heart on remaining in the European Union, and I'm afraid he's making arguments that don't stand up to any scrutiny.
Sorry, on that issue of housing, let's just get real about this. During the whole tenure of Boris Johnson's time in City Hall, we should have been building at least 50,000 homes.
Talking about the whole country now, Chukwuemeka.
Well, why do we
I live in London. Jacob,
why do we
if
need
we'd
more
actually
houses?
built the houses...
We need more houses
the
because
idea
the
that if we got rid of all the immigrants, say, in London,
because of
we wouldn't have a
immigration.
housing
These
problem
two
is
must
ridiculous.
follow.
One at a time. Chukwuemeka, make your point. I'll get a response.
The reason we've got a housing problem is because our domestic governments have not built enough homes.
We've no idea how
You just said that yourself,
Why do we need more homes? We need more homes because the population's growing, and the population's growing because we've got mass immigration of which we have no control.
It would grow anyway. It would grow anyway.
Seems to be some support. Let's just ask the politicians to pause. Let's bring a businessman in. Richard, apologies for you coming to you last. Let's talk about the impact that people would say, particularly in your line of work, that the people who come here, that take the jobs here, is what's driven this economy on. We're, I think, the fifth most powerful economy in the world. We're in growth, and a lot of that is due to the fact that folk want to come here. How accurate is that?
Well, as you're saying, I'm a business person. I'm not a politician, so there's nothing I have to say or not to say, and I'm not informed by ideology. I'm just informed by a very pragmatic view and the experience of having set up a business from a market stall that now employs 350 people. Immigration is firstly an opportunity. It's an opportunity for a country to grow, for a business to get employees, and it's also what it did without having the free movement of labour. I could send talented people from the UK into other countries to establish our business there, which allowed us to sell our products into that market whilst generating the revenues and employing many more people here. So it is firstly an opportunity. It, of course, does bring with it some downsides and some things to be managed. I'm not trying to gloss it well, because there is always a downside to the upside. But firstly, it is absolutely a great opportunity. And secondly, not as a business person, just as a regular person, 2 little anecdotes. I went to A&E recently because I was in a bit of a state, and I was treated mainly, but not exclusively, by medical staff from different EU countries. My nan, who has been in a care home until she died recently, she was cared for mainly by people that come from EU countries. We should stop beating up on these people that are prepared to leave their homes and their families to come here to work, who do a lot of the tough jobs that prop up the public services, and, quite frankly, do jobs that are classed as unskilled, but are hugely important, especially to a population growing in age, such as social care. So I think we should be saying a little bit more thank you and a little bit less making the subject of...
Can I just say on that, because it's quite important.
And again, a point I need to point out for the team watching, those watching, a lot of applause in the room for what Richard has said. Kate, isn't that the truth? Isn't that we wouldn't have a National Health Service?
I've got St Thomas's Hospital in my constituency, and I'm there regularly. And it is full of people working as nurses, as doctors, as in all the admin staff that's needed in hospitals. And a lot of those people are treated, because they're not white, as if they're migrants. They are 3rd, 4th, 5th generation Afro-Caribbean who feel as British as anybody and are as British. And this somehow
Richard
this
was talking
idea
about Eastern Europeans specifically, Kate.
There are far more people working in St Thomas's Hospital who have lived in the borough or have lived near the borough for many, many years. And I really find this idea that somehow, if you're not white, you must be a migrant.
All right.
Say that. I didn't say anything like that at all. I said
he did say Eastern Europeans.
You did say.
I said EU migrants.
Yes, EU migrants.
They
I'm sorry,
prop
Eastern Europe, my apologies.
they prop up our public services. They are primary school teachers, they are nurses, they are care workers. They do the tough jobs that this economy depends on, that a lot of people don't want to do.
Isn't there an argument?
And also, the really bizarre consequence of your point-based system would be, it would make, quite frankly, the good jobs harder to get if you're a British national, and it would leave and make it easier to get the tough jobs. Now, I've just become a father the first time. I do not aspire for my daughter to grow up to be a potato picker. As much that's an important job and we need people to do it, we should be grateful for those that do.
But the problem, Richard, is the problem is that for people without big skills looking for jobs out in this country, what the effect of a complete free supply of unskilled and semi-skilled labour is, we've driven people's wages to the floor. The minimum wage has become the maximum wage for year after year, and the living standards of people, not entrepreneurs like you, but the living standards of somebody on an average salary have fallen by 10% in the last 8 years. That actually is pretty shocking.
Siobhan, you're next. I must bring Jacob Rees-Mogg in. Jacob, I want to explore the point with you. We wouldn't have an NHS, we wouldn't have people driving the buses, we wouldn't have people cleaning hospital floors without people coming, without immigration.
Absolute nonsense on 2 counts. First of all, you set the points-based system to get the talent that you need. You set it for the individual jobs and professions. And secondly, in this country, there are over 9 million people economically inactive, of whom 2.2 million want to get back to work. What we need to be doing is encouraging those people who are currently economically inactive and want work to get into work. But currently they find that extremely difficult, because the free movement of people means that some of the entry-level jobs are taken by people coming from Eastern Europe. And we want to look after people who are already here. And bear in mind what Lord Rose said, the leader of the Remain campaign, who I think is now hidden in the Tower of London because he tells embarrassing truths. But he said that if we left the European Union, the wages of the lowest paid would go up. And that should be an ambition for any sensible government.
Siobhan.
I'm here today because I am not a Euro fanatic. But I am really worried about the tone of the conversation that we are having. That somehow we're saying to people, if we get out of the EU, we'll sort out immigration. Show me the developed country in the world that has sorted out immigration. We will sort out
Some
housing.
would argue Australia.
We will sort out housing. We won't sort out housing by stopping EU migrants. We know that housing is complicated. We're not building enough. Too many people are able to come here and invest in property as investment vehicles rather than places to live. We have people's incomes not keeping up with the increase in property prices. The idea that some people's pay is not keeping up with our aspirations is somehow something exclusively to do with the EU is completely wrong. We have problems, and those are problems that should be addressed by our government, whether they're investment in the NHS, whether they're good jobs and training, whether they're immigration. Those problems will stay with us however we vote on June 23rd and won't be resolved by the vote on June 23rd.
Siobhan, just address this, that there will be a lot of people watching and people in the audience here will say, it's all very well what you say about housing, but how come we can find it in our hearts to find a home for a one-legged Albanian drug dealer?
I would say that too many people believe nonsense. If you're a one-legged...
Respectfully, it's not nonsense.
No, if you're a one-legged Albanian drug dealer,
you're not
entitled to housing in the UK.
One.
You're not entitled to it.
Well,
if anybody here would like to come to my advice surgery that I hold every Friday, and I see about 40 lots of people, and Mary and Dolores are with me, and they work as receptionists at my surgery, the biggest problem is housing. And the biggest number of people who come to see me are people born and brought up here of every age. The second group of people who come to see me are non-British nationals who are not from the EU. The idea that this problem goes away on June 21st, just take a leap in the dark and stick out of the EU, you're being sold a pup.
All right.
I agree with that, and also I'm not having left for the record what Jacob just said, which is somehow trying to imply that the EU is bad for the average worker, which is complete nonsense.
That's what the leader of your campaign said.
This was a thing that existed to protect workers' rights, the broader maternity, paternity. It is by every single independent economic institution in the world.
It came from the leader of your campaign.
No.
I'm talking about
Lord Rose. Lord Rose said this to the Treasury Select Committee in evidence. He said the wages of the lowest paid would go up if we left the European Union. So you're the deputy leader. Your leader said that that was the case.
I'm talking about every single independent global economic institution which has said categorically that the country is better off being in. We can debate all these smaller points. They're important, but they must never distract from the main point. The EU is the biggest market in the world. It is how this country grows. It is the biggest source of wealth. That is good for everyone. If you want to know what workers' interests, speak to the people that represent them. Every principal workers' union is on the record of saying the EU is good for workers.
The wages of the low paid are a pretty big issue in my constituency and in lots of constituencies across this country.
It is
and if they would go up, that is a good thing.
It is disingenuous, sir, to imply
I'm just quoting what your leader said.
It's disingenuous to imply that the EU is bad for workers.
So are you saying the leader of your campaign is a liar? That's quite a strong statement.
And it hasn't done very much for the poor workers of Greece, is it?
Let's bring Chuka Amuna. Let's bring Chuka Amuna in. Mr. Amuna.
I could come to Greece in a moment. Just two
workers'
things.
rights.
Workers' rights. Let me deal with workers' rights. I used to be an employment lawyer. Look, there are lots of things, lots of benefits that you all get at work which are derived from EU legislation. If you're a temporary agent, if you're being discriminated against in the workplace on the basis of your religion, you have the benefit of protections that have their basis in EU legislation. Now, what people like Nigel and the others here may say quite rightly is, well, we don't need a European Union to give you rights at work. A domestic government can do that. Now that's true. I don't necessarily deny that. But what Kate and I know as Labour politicians is when you have a Conservative government, they don't necessarily protect your rights at work. But for me, there is a bigger argument about your rights at work.
That's democracy.
Hang on just a moment.
That's why we find elections.
I hope there'll be a Labour government in the future too. Can you sign in all your remain law? Is that you're worried there'll never be a Labour government again?
If you let me finish a point, because there is a bigger point here on workers' rights. At the moment, at least we have minimum standards that apply across 28 member states. And what that means is that British workers cannot be played off against the workers in other member states. So you can't have a big multinational company saying, look, to Britain, if you don't adopt those same lower wages and terms and conditions in another EU country, we're going to take our business because we have those minimum standards, what it does, it prevents a race to the bottom on your terms and conditions at work. And I want to just deal with this second point, which is this, oh, we've got all these people and they're coming here and they're taking our jobs. Yeah? Lots of people say that. I read it in the Express often. They're taking our jobs. Now, the reality of the situation is the people who are doing those jobs, if we removed them, whatever European they may be, the idea that British workers who haven't been given the skills that they need, and that's the problem, we've got chronic skill shortages, could just walk into those jobs given they haven't got the skills, is for the birds. Part of the problem that we have with people who are economically inactive is that we haven't given them the right technical and vocational skills, more apprenticeships, for example, so that they actually have the skills to do those jobs in the first place. We are not If we got rid of all the immigrants, so to speak, the idea that people without the skills could just walk into those jobs is absolute fiction.
All right, Mr. Amina, thank you. Nigel Farage, one group of would-be immigrants made a lot of headlines earlier this week, people who tried to get into Kent, a county you're very familiar with, into Dymchurch. What should happen to those 17 or 18 people now?
Yeah, I was there on Monday in Dymchurch. I've got friends that live on the seafront there, and they're very worried and very scared because the only reason we've really had this highlighted is that one of the boats got into trouble and the lifeboat went out to save them. There have been boats coming in there now for several months. Everyone's down there has been talking about it. There were 18 people from Albania who are currently in Dover, as I understand it. Albania is a potential member state, of course, of the European Union. And yet five of the 18...
It's the country that Michael Gove wants us to be
Five
like.
of the 18... That's true, actually. 5 of the 18... Well, that's an even bigger endorsement for what I'm about to say. So 5 of the 18 are now claiming asylum. And I fear that if we grant asylum status to people from a potential member of the European Union, we send a signal to the criminal gangs and the traffickers and to people prepared to take risks. Take that risk, come here, you've got every chance of staying. I can promise you, the Straits of Dover, which I know well are not the Mediterranean, with the tides, the sandbanks, it's a risky place. If we do not make sure that all 18 go back to Calais, then I'm afraid we're in for a summer where we will see drownings and bodies washed up on the Kent beaches. We must deal with this.
Siobhan McDonough, do you want to get involved in this?
I don't think anybody would disagree. If those people have come wrongly here, they deserve to be sent back. If they make a claim for asylum, I'm no lawyer, but I would suggest it should be refused. But the idea that immigration isn't an issue if we come out of the EU is completely wrong. What do you think is going to happen? What the French are going to do if we come out of the EU? Do you think they're going to let our border force stay at Calais? Do you think we're going to be able to see or interview people there? Do you think they're going to stop people getting on the boats?
What's going to happen to
come
them,
here?
McDonough?
Our border will become Dover. It won't become Calais.
So what? So what?
When all those people are coming here illegally, then you're going to worry
then we
about
refuse them entry. That is the whole point of having a border. You don't have to let everybody in.
Hold on. You've got to remember.
Richard Reid in a moment.
You've got to remember why the French agreed to this bilateral treaty. Because the train companies and the ferry companies get fined if they take passengers on board. The airlines get fined very heavily if they bring people into this country illegally, and therefore they were not allowing them to board.
Ryanair have just got
Ryanair won on judgment on forged documents, which they had accepted. But they are not allowed to take people with the wrong documents, and they're not allowed to carelessly accept forged documents, otherwise they get fined. And therefore they weren't taking them from Calais onto their boats or onto their trains. So there was this mass of people being left in France by the ferry and the train operators, and the French therefore had to do something about it. That will not change if we leave the European Union, and it is a bilateral treaty, not an EU treaty.
Richard Reid, you wanted to come in on this?
Well, I was just going to comment on the illogicness of what Nigel was saying. We're talking about Albania. They're not part of the EU, and he's using that as an example of why it would be better to come out. It doesn't make sense, because migration is definitely going to be an issue of our era. There are strengths to it, there are issues with it. Fundamentally, we are better at dealing with it together rather than pretending we can pull up some drawbridge. We will just become definitely then more of a target. It's insane. Otherwise, there's no
in what way, Richard?
common sense.
In what way, and it's fair to say a lot of people agree, in what way would we become more of a target?
Because the rest of continental Europe will be able to just quietly let the problem go over to the UK, rather than us as a team address what will be fundamentally an increasingly global issue.
I mean,
the idea that you are not stronger together is nonsense. We know we are
Moving on from
stronger
this, have
together.
the last word for now on this subject. Chuka Umunna.
Well, I think if you look at the migration crisis and what created it and precipitated it happening in recent times, it was not the European Union. It was huge instability in the Middle East, and of course there's growing instability and jihadism in Africa, and that wouldn't go away if we left the European Union. And I'm not saying the European Union has done a perfect job in handling the migration crisis. It certainly hasn't. But I don't see how else you deal with that issue, given it's cross-border, than within a European framework.
Well, second only, we must move on, Mr Farage, perhaps to try and get you in on other matters, but we must turn our attention to other matters, and it is the economy. And here are the numbers being bandied around about our future in or out of the EU. The Remain side say we have access to the world's largest tariff-free economy, and according to the Prime Minister, leaving would be tantamount to economic self-harm. It would leave us to fill a £30 to £40 billion black hole in our public finances, and we'd spend the next 10 years negotiating new trade deals. Now Leave say, come off it, we're powerful enough to stand on our own 2 feet. We could use the £350 million a week EU membership to finance the building of NHS hospitals, schools and housing that we've spoken of already. Chuka Umunna, why shouldn't we build more hospitals with the money?
Well, I don't quite see it like that, in the sense that by being part of this big trading bloc, it creates a lot more economic activity than otherwise would be produced, which of course delivers gains to the exchequer. And can I just be absolutely clear, because we're going to go down this kind of rabbit warren otherwise. I am not arguing. I don't think anybody amongst the... I mean, Nigel's called us... What do you call us? The Romanians. Amongst the Romanians...
Well, what a joke. I mean,
I know. And I use the gag quite often now, actually, Nigel. But the point is, I don't think anybody here is arguing that if we left the European Union, we wouldn't be able to trade with those countries at all. That is not the argument. The argument is the terms on which we would be able to trade with them. And we get this huge advantage in the sense that we're able to trade with these guys tariff-free. Now, if we weren't able to do that, just to make this, kind of real for people, if you traded under World Trade Organization rules, we are looking at a 10% tariff on our cars. Think how much that is going to, how much extra that means a car's going to cost. Think about the stuff you go and buy from the shop. So 28% of the produce on high street store shelves comes from the EU. So when you go and get your daily produce, well, maybe not your Express newspaper, which I imagine is printed here, but, cheese, wine, chocolate, that kind of thing, beers, he says. These things you're going to be paying more for. So it's partly the price that you pay, but it's also the economic activity that's generated through the companies that trade here. Now, the other big thing, people say, only 5% of our companies, or I think 6% of our companies, export to the EU. Now, remember, 44% of our exports go to the EU. But taking that 6%, if it is just 6%, and it's disputed that, companies are not islands. There's a whole ecosystem around them. So the people who work there, they go and spend their money elsewhere. There is a supply chain there. So our whole economy, you might have someone who doesn't export, but in the end, it's connected. We're all globally connected. And that is where the real advantage comes for us in terms of jobs. I'll just give you an example.
Briefly, if you would.
Fujitsu. So Fujitsu, I was speaking to the head of Fujitsu in the UK. Fujitsu has more inward investment here than pretty much all the other Japanese companies put together. And over the last 3 to 4 years, they've made a £3.9 billion investment here. And this is where they really choose to situate their European hub, is here in the UK. And a massive part of the reason that they make their investment here is because we're part of the European Union. And we've been fighting with the Poles, the French, the Italians and the Germans to get that inward investment. Now, if we weren't in the EU, that would massively have compromised Fujitsu UK's ability to get that here. And these people employ tens of thousands of people in this country.
And it's worth saying, Jacob Rees-Mogg, that that's one company and one of many companies, major companies, employing tens of thousands of British people who are all for the Remain camp. How do you respond to that?
Well, first of all, a lot of them said exactly the same about the euro. They said they would all leave if we didn't join the euro, and they're all still here and they've invested more. And a great, symbolic, totemic takeover is taking place at the London Stock Exchange by the German Stock Exchange, running into, I think, £20 billion of value, and that's going ahead as we are debating leaving. So I'd follow the money rather than the rhetoric. But I just want to challenge a point that's been made on tariffs. No intelligent government and such things do sometimes exist, would put a tariff on...
Have we got one now?
Really?
Do we have one now, Mr.
We've got a brilliant government in all respects other than Europe.
Just checking.
Would put tariffs on food imports into this country. It would be crazy. And the real damage the EU does to us is that we don't belong to a free trade area, we belong to a customs union. And it's all about a closed fortress Europe that keeps out products from the rest of the world. So a Japanese car that you buy in the UK has a 10% tariff on it, where a German one doesn't. Why should that be? Why should we pay more if we want to buy a Japanese car? And when we come to negotiate deals, bear in mind we have a huge deficit with Europe. So we have an £11 billion deficit in car manufacturing. 1 million jobs in Germany relate to selling things to the UK. What are the German car manufacturers going to say if they put tariffs on us and we fight back? What about Ireland? Ireland sells us over £800 million of beef a year. If we put tariffs on that, the Irish farming industry would be destroyed. Now, do you really think that the European Union will sacrifice the interests of the Irish economy, an economy that's already borne so much for the sake of the euro?
Greece, Mr. Rees.
The point is that Ireland has been the poster boy for recovery from the euro disaster. So do you really think they would sacrifice Ireland in a fit of pique when we've left, when so much depends on what we buy from
things
Europe?
on? Exactly, thank you. Rather than sort of talk about weird hypothetical situations in the future, I'm going to talk to you about, just for a brief moment, about my business, which I've set from a market stall, myself, two close friends. For the first 7 years, we traded only in the UK. We employed 80 people. After 7 years, we decided to chance our luck and we started trading in the EU. We now employ 350 people in the UK. So since we've gone into Europe, we've gone from employing 80 people to 350 people. Now, you could say, OK, that's one example. I went to 222 of the high-growth entrepreneurs of this country, the people that have set up the countries that you'd see on the high street that have made life better, easier, cheaper, more fun. Places where you buy your T-shirts, your Domino's pizzas, your Itsu sushis, your Deliveroo deliveries, your Bromptons bicycles. Out of 222 high-growth entrepreneurs, I asked who wants to come out, who wants to stay in, and who don't know. 12 were don't know or don't want to say. Every single other entrepreneur was a definite yes for in. There wasn't a single no, because they know
I think that's
the most basic,
impossible.
the most... It's not, I've got the data.
Yeah, possible.
And now, you see, the difference between the outside and the inside is...
Just so everybody hears, Nigel Farage has said
we always have...
Mr. Reid.
There's one big difference between the inside and the outside is we always have data and evidence, whereas you guys just make accusations, go, everything's rubbish. You just make... You do it really well. You do it better than anyone. You make great emotional arguments, but there's no logic, there's no evidence, and there's no data. Anyway, back to what I was saying.
I asked all my friends and they want to leave. I mean, you know, this is sort of just down in the pub stuff.
On public record, this is high-growth entrepreneurs. Right. But anyway, let's just take the most common sense argument, right? What we all agree is the EU is the biggest market in the world, so it's a massive upside opportunity for every UK entrepreneur and every UK employee. If you go to that biggest customer in the world and poke it in the eye, which is what leaving would be, how is that going to improve matters? I'm not saying it's going to make it a disaster. Of course, we'll be able to negotiate and find some way to hopefully one day get back to close as good as we've got it now. But how is it going to help? Right. We should not misunderstand what it is we're talking about. It's asking for a divorce. Now, I don't know who's had personal experience of that, but a divorce, if you handle it and you negotiate well, you still maybe get to keep some visitation rights and all that kind of stuff, but you're definitely going to be poorer. Yeah. Every single economic institution, not individual people, not just saying stuff, but with data, with analysis, it just shows. It's either going to be a little bit less good or a lot less good. They are the spread of outcomes. It's a massive opportunity. We don't want to piss on our own chips.
All right, OK, thank you, thank you. Sorry about the graphic nature of the language.
Viewers.
And sorry for any divorced men in the room, I know exactly how you're feeling. Let's let the panel have a sip of water as we go to some questions from the floor. And I think we want to get a microphone, please, to Patrick, who's a gentleman in a blue suit over here. Nuz, if you could pass that. We have a question from Patrick. Have a sip of water.
UKIP MEP.
Yes, I think we recognise him as from UKIP. Patrick, thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Have to state as health warning, UKIP member and MEP.
Indeed. In the extremely probable event of another major Eurozone crisis, will Britain be best placed to cope with the financial and migratory impact from inside or from outside the EU?
Start with Chuka Umunna. We've touched a little bit on this. Chuka?
And did you talk? Sorry, were you talking about a crisis in the eurozone? I slightly, as you said that. Another crisis in the eurozone. Look, I think the idea that if we leave the European Union, we would not be affected by what happens in the eurozone is for the birds. Look, the eurozone is a massive bloc. We're not in it. But we will definitely be affected by it. And if you look at the downturn that we had and the fall in growth in 2011 through 2013, that was precipitated in part by what was happening in the Eurozone. I don't think that would have been any different were we outside. Now, there is a question there which Patrick might come back on and say, but maybe we won't trade as much with the EU. I don't know if you'd concede that if we came out, and therefore maybe we wouldn't be so exposed. I just simply don't think that would be the case. And at least when decisions are being made to try and resolve economic problems in the European Union, at least we are round the table and actually can impact on it. I think that is a really important point. We actually have some capacity to influence others when resolving global financial crises, which are often, cross-jurisdictional and affect a lot of countries.
Muttering away. Nigel Farage?
We haven't got much influence. I mean, look, since David Cameron became Prime Minister, there have been 40 occasions when the British government has gone to Brussels, to the Council of Ministers, to say, look, we do not want this piece of legislation. It's bad for our businesses. It's bad for our national interest. And on all 40 occasions, we've lost. And in fact, there were 32 times before that when Gordon Brown lost. So this idea that we've got some great influence, our influence is not that significant. But Nick, can I just go back to something? What Chuka said earlier was dead right. It's very refreshing, actually, to hear somebody on the Remain side say, if we leave the European Union, of course we'll go on trading, it just depends on the terms. And to hear that, which is a sensible conversation at which we can have a debate, compared with to the utter rubbish we're hearing from George Osborne and the Prime Minister that the sky would fall in and nobody would ever trade with us.
But these deals could take years.
Well,
I mean,
hang on.
a decade of deals I think we've got here.
Nick, we joined a common market. We did it because we lived in a world of high tariffs. It was economically the right thing to do. And it did actually net benefit British business for the first few years. But we're now part of a single market, which is effectively the centrepiece of a political union. And my point would be this, that for what we may be saving in tariffs, we're having to pay a net membership fee of £34 million a day, accept the unlimited free movement of people, have our ability to make our own arrangements globally taken away from us, and we have to regulate the 88% of the British economy that does not trade with the EU. And here's the truth of it. Here's the truth of it. We leave the EU, and let's just say that our friends in France and Germany and Italy say, well, we're going to cut off our own noses to spite our faces. They won't, for the reasons that Jacob has put. But even if they did, the worst case scenario is no deal with the EU, and no deal, actually, financially, would be advantageous to us over the rotten deal we've got right now.
I know you're going to quick remarks, Jacob, and then you're going to counter both. Jacob,
I just want to come very directly to Patrick's point about our influence, because a little noticed part of David Cameron's renegotiation was that we gave away our ability to influence any treaty changes in relation to changes that the Eurozone nations needed. So we've actually given up that influence in return for the very thin gruel the Prime Minister brought back from Brussels.
And we also got a guarantee not to be called in to do any bailouts.
Can I just say that I just totally reject this talking down of British influence abroad and in Europe. Look, I hold absolutely no flag for Conservative Prime Ministers, but the truth is, over the years, over the decades in the European Union, British Prime Ministers and Ministers have been quite good, actually, at getting their way. And that's why, if you look at the independent data that's collected on
Did the Prime Minister do well a couple of months ago, Mr. Umunna?
What, in terms of the renegotiation? Yeah. I think he got some important things from it. I've never said it was groundbreaking, by the way. I thought he got some important things from it. But the point is, in 9 out of 10 times, when there is a vote on the European Council, the UK is in the majority side. So why talk down our country in this way? And on the issue of trade deals that both Nigel and Jacob brought up, now and they're saying, well, why would they want to sacrifice all that custom they get from us? I think the point is the EU is a far bigger and important customer to the UK than we are to each of the 27 other member states. As I said, 44% of our exports are going to them, so they're a huge customer in that sense. On average, if you look at the 27 other member states that we would leave behind, on average, 5% of their exports come to us, each of them. So we're nowhere near as important to them as a customer as they are to us. And that's the point. That will impact when you're doing a deal. And at least when we're doing a deal with these people, and we're negotiating with others outside of the EU, like, say, I don't know, China or Australia and Malaysia, we're negotiating an EU deal with those guys. We are sitting on one side of the table with 500 million other people negotiating with these big trading blocs. We are far stronger. We're in a much better position to do that.
Let's take
And stuck in a blind alley.
let's take in a second. There's a James, I think. There's a question from a James on the floor. Where is James? Thank you very much indeed, one of my colleagues. James.
Yes, hi. So, if the EU damages our ability to trade globally, why does Belgium, the Netherlands, Sweden, Germany, Italy, France, Ireland and others all export more per head to the rest of the world than we do?
Let's start with Kate Hoey, who's been quiet for too long. Kate Hoey?
Well, I think we probably could be doing more, and that's where we do have some influence and say within our own governments of not perhaps doing enough to work even harder to export. But I think you'll find that actually the figures, I mean, I'm not sure where you're quoting those figures from, and if that's an actual fact or is that another quite a scare story. But
Well, Switzerland exports more per head than anybody in the European Union. It's not in the European Union.
And Norway is actually one of the most richest countries in the world, and they're not in the European Union. And Iceland is actually doing extremely well, being a very, very small country. So, you know, I don't think you can argue that just because they are actually exporting more, that somehow is a reason for us as the nation of the United Kingdom to not want to be in control of our own destiny.
Nigel
No, but
Farage,
he's talking about the myth that you guys put forward, that we somehow need to come out of the EU to trade with these other countries, which is total nonsense. What the EU gives us is the biggest market in the world, great, and absolutely also the ability to go and trade with every country.
But
in terms of Chucker's point, in total, the BRICS, the fastest growing economies in the world, they represent 8% of our exports versus the 44% of the EU. So please, let's do business with the whole world as we can and as we do, but let's not take our eye off the main prize, which is the EU right there on our doorstep. It's the big
the single market gives us higher prices because it puts tariffs on the rest of the world. It increases...
It's economic nonsense. It's such economic nonsense.
Jacob Rees-Mogg, it's bringing down the cost of mobile phone tariffs, all things like that.
That's a high-level international agreement that's being implemented at the European level. If you read Christopher Booker, you'd know all about that. But we have tariffs against the rest of the world.
Prime Minister said cheaper socks.
Cheaper socks? Ridiculous. We have tariffs on textiles from outside the EU. We have tariffs that make our goods more expensive. If you take agriculture, we have tariffs on fertilisers and agricultural chemicals to help the German chemical interests.
And we have tariffs.
This is another example. This is another example.
I would just like to say that we have tariffs on very, very poor farmers in developing countries that are actually, I can't understand how anyone on the left can support something like that.
The answer to this question. Obsession, it would appear, amongst some of the corporate companies in this country and our politicians. It's Europe, 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 as if it's the be-all and end-all. Let's be frank, it is a declining part of the world economy. We're listening to 1970s arguments. We need to be free to have free trade with the broader emerging parts of the world for the 21st century.
I tell you, no, sorry, there are some...
Richard Reed first, Chucker, thank you. Richard Reed and then you, Chucker. Richard Reed.
It's just, I'm just sort of always perplexed by the lunacy, lack of logic of any of the arguments. It's the biggest market in the world, so let's have that first. It's the biggest market in the world by a massive margin. The second biggest market in the world is about to come online and give us free trade agreement because of the EU. The EU gives us free trade agreement with the other 50 other big economies in the world. Sorry, 6 more. So the lunacy of the argument is the very first thing. The very first thing we would have to do.
Have a deal with China.
If you win,
Switzerland have more deals than we do.
If you win,
Mr. Reed, thank you.
I'm just saying.
We will come back to Mr. Reed. We must have, and we must move on. Chucker, in a final sense, because we move on to other matters.
I'm just very amused at Nigel complaining about us being obsessed with the Europe issue, coming from Nigel, who's made Europe the centre of his career.
We just want to get on with business. We just want to get on with creating jobs.
We want to get
and we
on
want to get
running
on
our
with
own
business.
country and
Thank you,
choosing
panel.
our own destiny.
Can I
and
just
having a
say-
global
we
future.
have another. Let's
Can I
let
just
the
say on
audience
my own business?
half a sentence.
My own business has found, which is financial services, and I'm still involved in it, has consistently found it easier to sell financial services outside the EU than inside.
Okay, panel, thank you for that. Thank you for observing that. We move to another question. I think it says an Alex in the audience. Is it Alex somewhere? Do we have? Yes, sir. Thank you in the blue shirt.
As a passionate supporter of the NHS, am I right or wrong to be greatly concerned that exiting the EU will leave the NHS in danger of facing a major skills and funding shortage?
Let's come to Siobhan McDonough. We talked a little bit about the NHS, and just bring another argument in. All this money that supposedly goes out to Europe, I bet the people, your constituents, would love another hospital, wouldn't they? Would love protection of the NHS as Alex.
Close it, St Helier Hospital. St Helier Hospital spends tens of thousands of pounds every month on a private agency staff because it hasn't got enough skilled staff. So what are they currently doing? They are out in Spain and in Portugal to attract the highly trained nurses from those countries to bring them back here to work. And they are saving money. So if those people weren't there wouldn't be nurses from the UK. There wouldn't be other nurses to come here that easily. They are doing enormously good work here, and they come here without having to apply for visas and the difficulties of doing that, and they do an enormously good job. You know, this issue about the NHS, I'm here because my mum, Breda, is a Daily Express reader. She is 92 years of age, and if you met her, she sounds exactly the same as she did when she got off the boat in 1947 to become the first generation of nurses in the brand new NHS. And the breeders of today are the people from Spain and from Portugal who are coming here to do jobs that we don't have people trained to do. And this government is about to make it worse by getting rid of NHS bursaries and forcing potential nurses to pay student fees. The reason why we don't have nurses, we don't have enough midwives, is because we don't train and we don't invest. Time.
Okay, Siobhan,
so that's a very good reason why we need to.
Can I also just say something?
As long as you keep it on Europe, because we're getting a little off topic,
No,
if you would.
sorry, directly to this guy's question, it was about
Sure.
NHS. Actually, don't ask the six of us, mate, because, you know, I'm a guy that sells fruit juice, but I do know this. In the same way, if I was on a plane, I want to know how the flight was going, I'd ask the pilot. If you ask the guy that runs the NHS, he is clear and categoric. Right. The NHS is better served off by staying in, not coming out. He's the person we should listen to, not us six.
All right. We move to other areas. We now know that immigrants are entering the UK illegally by boat, as we've just discussed, crossing the English Channel from France. We've since discovered this is not an isolated incident, as one of the panel has said. We don't have the resources to fully tackle the problem. Arguably, terrorism should be the #1 threat facing the country, sparking concerns about what the government is doing to protect us from the sort of atrocities we witnessed in Paris and we witnessed in Brussels. So the question is, are we safer in or out of Europe? Many would say, Nigel Farage, that we are far safer in Europe to combat terrorism with Europol and others. Are you playing fast and loose with our security?
Well, I'm afraid what Angela Merkel did last year was to make one of the biggest policy errors of modern times we've seen in the Western world. She wholly irresponsibly said, please come. As many of you as want to come, we can accept. And they came. Not a single one of them was background checked. And 1 million people went into Germany alone, about another 600,000 to the rest of Europe. Very, very few of those people would ever have qualified as refugees under the Geneva Convention definition. They were people leaving places that we may not wish to live, but they weren't refugees. And the problem is this. You know, the boss of Europol, an EU institution, says that now up to 5,000 potential jihadi fighters have entered the European Union in the course of the last 15 months.
How would he know?
The boss of, well, that's his estimate, but that's his job, is to anticipate problems. The boss of Interpol said, you may as well have put up a sign saying terrorists welcome. And I think, you know, when you look at the fact that it only took 8 people to commit those atrocities in France, and when ISIS tell us they are using this crisis to flood the continent, we probably ought to believe them.
Do you think they're in Britain?
I'm sure, well, to be honest, we've got a homegrown problem already. We saw that with the London bombings. You know, we are not immune from any of this. The question is, are we safer with the free movement of people? And my concern is that those unchecked people that went to Germany and places like that last year will in a few short years have EU passports and be able to come. To me, it is plain logical common sense that by controlling our borders, we will not be completely isolated from it, but at least safer than we would be. Free movement of people has been, I'm afraid, in security terms, a disaster.
Shukla Amuna.
Well, I'll give Nigel this. At least he conceded and, well, didn't concede, but admitted that if we look at London, the terrible, awful atrocity of the killing of drummer Lee Rigby and other attempts there have been, this has primarily been, unfortunately, a homegrown
Different
problem.
in Paris and Brussels, though.
Yep, I absolutely
That speaks more
accept
to
that.
what Nigel
The second thing is, what being in the European Union has helped us with is cooperation in sorting out this issue. So the European arrest warrant, for example, I'm not saying it's massively efficient, but it has been very helpful. We've been able to send out of our country, remove over 5,000 people and bring over 1,000 people back here to face justice, including one of the people who attempted to do another parallel bombing during 7/7. We also have a prisoner exchange programme. We share intelligence through the Schengen Information System and also criminal information system so that we can actually get these terrorists and deal with them. So that cooperation, I think, is vital because, let's be honest about this, global terror knows no borders. This is something you do have to deal with on a cross-border basis. And if we came out, do we really believe that we would not have a challenge? I also just want to say something about, I do not believe for one moment that all the people that Nigel refers to as coming in from Syria, I don't believe all these people are going to end up as European citizens. I simply don't think that is going to happen. And also, it's very important.
Where will they go, Mr.
Well, look, if they became European citizens, obviously Nigel's argument is they're all going to come to the UK. I don't believe they will become European citizens and get European passports. And another very important point here, free movement does not apply to refugees. That is a really important point because you hear people talking about this as if as soon as you get in, you just go. No, that is not how the rules work.
Do we really think that if we were to leave the EU, Europol, which we were actually instrumental in helping set up, and I was a Home Office Minister at the time, that we would not be continuing to be members of Europol? There are countries in Europol who are not members of the European Union. You know, this idea that somehow the only way Europe works in any kind of cooperation is if you have to be part of this political structure. So I reject really the whole emphasis on the idea that somehow leaving would make us less safe in terms of cooperation. We cooperate with countries now. We cooperate with America much more. Or the actual intelligence comes much more from countries like Australia, New Zealand, and America and Canada. The big,
Yes, but
that is really important. And none of that is going to end. We are a big country. You were talking earlier about playing our country down. This is playing our country down. The idea that the rest of the world would suddenly say, oh my goodness, the United Kingdom's left the European Union. We mustn't talk to them anymore.
There's a complete illogic to what you're saying because you say we have all these beneficial things that we're cooperating on security and defence, so we need to come out so we can keep doing that. That doesn't make any sense at all. And
because there are other reasons for coming out which we haven't got on to. The whole democratic argument, which is to me the most important part.
You talked about the Five Eyes intelligence sharing agreement, which is an agreement we have with Australia, the US and others. All of the leaders of those countries want us to stay in the European Union because they think we'll be stronger, better, safer and better,
they want us to stay in the European Union,
and
like
you talked
most
about
of
America,
the other countries
who admittedly,
in the EU.
Kate was right to refer to America as perhaps being our primary intelligence sharing partner. President Obama has been absolutely clear. He believes on a whole number of levels that it is far better for Britain to stay in the European Union than be out, particularly on security grounds.
Because it's in their interest for us to stay in. I'm interested in our interest. I'm interested in this country.
Quickly from Richard Reid, then Jacob Rees-Mogg.
How can any of us six claim to be that we know what's best for tackling terrorism? That is an unbelievably complex issue. What we do have to say, it's stated for the record, the mass majority of people that work in the intelligence services, the police services, the armed forces, they're all absolutely categoric.
They're not all.
The majority, it is a statement of fact, the majority of the intelligence service leaders, the military leaders,
saying
and the police
majority,
leaders.
I hasten to add.
I am saying majority. You will
not
always
saying
have anecdote. I'm saying majority. It's a fact. I know it doesn't fit your narrative. It's a fact. Suck it up. Take it on the chin. The majority of them say we are
suck it up,
safer.
take it on the chin.
Absolutely. You've got lots on both sides. There are three things Chuka said that I think need to be challenged. The first is the European arrest warrant. Now, that is about arresting people after crimes have been committed, not about stopping crimes. We were told it was for terrorism, and then it was used to chase the family of a poor, sick boy halfway across the European continent. So it doesn't do what it's supposed to do. The prisoner reallocation, well, that was all in today's papers. It's failed. Thousands of them are still in this country, unreturned to their home bases. And the third point is, indeed, refugees don't automatically have the right of free movement. As soon as they get a passport of a nation-state of the EU, they do. And the Foreign Secretary reassured us on this. He said all these people in Germany wouldn't be able to come here because the Germans aren't very efficient at issuing passports. Well, I don't think that's very reassuring. And the absolutely key thing is that if we controlled our own borders, we could do what the Americans do, and we could make sure everybody, 24 hours before they come here, send us their details, we can check them against their list, we can take their fingerprints, and we can stop them if we think they are any type of danger at all, which we cannot do as long as we're in the EU.
In a sentence, because I've got someone to go to in the audience.
So in relation to getting the details, we get those through the Schengen information system. In relation to the European arrest warrant, it is wrong to say that hasn't worked. Why else would we have been able to send over 7,000 people back to their countries of origin? And look, in terms of prisoner exchange, we have an agreement, a common agreement, with all the different EU member states. Now, I'm not saying it's been fantastically efficient, but it does work. And if we came out of the European Union and we had to deal with them on the basis that we do with non-EU countries, well, we're going to have to negotiate prisoner exchange, information system management exchange with 27 members, the current 27 other member states. How long is that going to take?
All right, now both sides, you'll want to hear from the next person, because as we move towards the final stretch of the debate, Camilla is as yet undecided. So if we can get a microphone to the young lady with the black top. You're undecided and you have a question. Where are we going, Camilla?
So I'm a journalist on the Sunday Express, and a lot of our readers are concerned about security. And I think, not to scaremonger more, because we've probably had enough of that on both sides, we are facing the prospect, somewhat terrifyingly, of Donald Trump perhaps becoming the next American president, a man who doesn't seem to believe in NATO, who doesn't seem to believe in protecting people abroad. If America abandons us and we leave the EU, aren't we going to be left in a lot more of a precarious position, not least with the prospect of Putin still being in power?
Nigel Farage, how concerned should we be about being stranded then if we've not got the EU with us, running to nanny, some would say, and we've got Donald Trump in the White House?
Well, we could have Hillary in the White House. I don't know what the outcome of that is going to be. Look, I don't think...
Would it be Trump or Hillary? Who would you
I would
choose?
never vote for Hillary. I think she's a crook. And
So you go for Trump?
And I think she'll get found out.
So you go for Trump?
I would certainly not vote for Hillary.
Would you go for Trump?
Just say
Would
if there's no evidence.
you go for Trump?
I worked for the company at the time of White Watergate, and let me tell you, I saw...
Let's move on. The Express newspapers...
You don't
Does
have
that
to
mean you
anyway,
vote for
so
Trump?
that's
You
fine.
vote for Trump?
I might abstain, but I wouldn't vote for Hillary if you...
But it is worth saying
you're
that
more likely to
very
vote for Trump.
It is worth saying the two world figures that are pro-Brexit are Donald Trump and Putin. They're the two guys that are for it.
Putin hasn't said a single word on this.
Well, the guys that are for the European Union include Oswald Mosley, the president of
Back to
China.
Mr. Farage.
You'll play that ridiculous game.
China,
This is important.
Yeah.
This is important.
So-
Just for a point of clarification, Express newspapers do not necessarily support the comments they're personally held by Nigel Farage as regards Hillary Clinton. We move on to Britain out of Europe and with Trump in the White House. Nigel Farage.
I don't think she's a crook. I didn't say she definitely was one.
You don't know how much I'm getting down my ear right now. I can hardly hear.
Okay, in terms of security, military security, the European Union wants its own army. All right, it's very simple. I confronted Nick Clegg with this back in 2014. He said I was a dangerous fantasist, and now we know the day after our referendum, the plans for a European army are going to be unveiled. I am very worried about that. I'm very worried about what I see an expansionist foreign policy that the European Union has. It's been very provocative in one or two parts of the world already, especially in the Ukraine, where it behaved
outrageous.
Where it behaved in the most...
You are rewriting history, Nigel.
Well, it happened 3 years ago. It really
absolutely
was
outrageous.
quite disgraceful. And I fear with the European army that we would find ourselves dragged into new conflicts, which frankly were none of our interest. The better model than a European army is a military structure where nation states cooperate together rather than giving up their ability to make decisions. And I do think that NATO has served us very well. And I frankly think it impossible that President Trump would take America out of NATO. I cannot foresee any circumstances. I don't see any circumstances in which he would. I really
Except
don't.
his own views.
Well, his bark in a campaign, I don't think in office he'll be anything like as extreme as we fear.
Let's get Chuka Umunna. You're almost jumping out of your seat.
Well, increasingly, Nigel's sounding like a Trump sympathiser and now a Putin apologist. There is absolutely...
Were you happy with the Ukraine? Were you happy that we actually encouraged the overthrow of an elected leader in the Ukraine? There was a coup.
Look,
there was a coup. It was a disgrace.
What happened in Ukraine was President Putin walked in there and took part of that country. And that is completely inexcusable.
That was later.
And trying to blame that on the European Union...
Can't rewrite history, Chapter. Sorry, mate.
Well, I think you're rewriting history.
The Crimea happened afterwards.
You are an apologist for President Putin.
No, I'm not.
But in terms of security and defence, look, if there was
any... call his work in Syria brilliant, Nigel. You're not an apologist, you're a fan.
Well, do you know what? Do you know what?
You're a fan of... Was it because he bombed civilians?
The fact that he stopped us going to war, which is what most of Parliament wanted to do in 2013, thank God we didn't go to war.
Well, and you know what I thought was really interesting? What was really interesting, I think, to be fair, one of the worst sort of decisions we've made in recent times as a country was to go to war in Iraq. All the EU countries were saying, do not do that. That was a UK-only decision. So just be careful in sort of seeing that we always make the right decisions.
On this issue of the European Union army, look, we would have a veto on that. There is not going to be a European Union army. There is absolutely no need for one. And in terms of helping to make the world a safer place, I actually think it's a good thing that Britain led within the EU to impose sanctions on an aggressive Russia led by President Putin. I also think it's a good thing that we led the charge in coming to what we hope in the end will make the world a safer place through the Iran nuclear deal. And I think both those things illustrate, actually, that the European Union has a role to play. We don't need a European Union army, which is why there won't be one.
But
actually, there's no reason why we can't cooperate.
Jacob Rees-Mogg, you're going first, and it plays into our final section, which is the whole issue of sovereignty. Some are saying Brussels pulls the strings of the UK. Westminster is nothing than an EU puppet. Leave campaigner Michael Gove says sovereignty really means, are you able to get things done? Are you able to change things, to fix things? Jacob Rees-Mogg, if you would address that and address also the idea that there would be a Euro army. Mr. Rees-Mogg.
On the European army, there is enhanced cooperation, and the proposal is for enhanced cooperation, which only requires 9 member states to go ahead. On the sanctions on Russian figures, the EU list was watered down compared to the US list, because the EU thought it affected the human rights of some of Putin's cronies. So the EU is weak when it comes to foreign policy, and it does have plans for an army.
So you want a tougher sanction?
I think the Americans got it right. I think the Americans, we should be close to the Americans, and we shouldn't insult somebody who may be the American president, because we have to work with him very closely. NATO is so over... It goes for Hillary as well. It goes for Hillary as well. It goes for
and to
either
the issue of sovereignty, Jacob
on the issue of sovereignty, this is essential. This is at the heart of it. Can you, with your vote, change your government? And increasingly, we can't. We can't do anything about trade. We can't have our own trade agreements. We can't do minor things. We couldn't change the tampon tax without the Council of Ministers asking the Commission if it would be kind enough to introduce a proposal, which it hasn't yet done, because only the unelected Commission has the right to propose new laws or appeal old laws. We can't roll out high-speed broadband in this country because the EU considers it to be illegal state aid, and we need to get a waiver from them. It's as much illegal state aid as building a new road is illegal state aid. This is the power of the European Union. We can't have a discount on petrol and diesel in rural areas without getting the permission of the European Union. This is all factually true, because the European Commission has to introduce any new law, and the European Court of Justice can strike down UK domestic law and has done so.
I'm hearing nonsense on my left.
There are people watching this debate through superfast broadband who have not been stopped doing that because of the European Union, including in rural areas. But look, in respect of this sovereignty issue,
we had to apply for an opt-out under state aid rules.
In respect of this sovereignty argument, just look at all the different things that have been dominating political debate over the last 5 to 6 years. Bedroom tax, NHS reorganisation, trebling of tuition fees, working tax credit cuts, you name
Bunches
it.
of bananas.
All of these things are things, ultimately, that the European Union has had nothing to do with whatsoever. The overwhelming majority of things that you hear us droning on and boring you on whatever show it might be, including LBC, are things, in the end, that are domestic. But where we choose to pool sovereignty, it's not to diminish our influence, but it's to amplify it, because we can deal with things together, often, much more effectively than we can do alone. We've talked about global terror. We haven't talked about the environment. Pollution knows no boundaries. If we want to actually get multinational companies who operate across borders to play fair, to pay their fair taxes, to stop ourselves being hedged against each other, dealing with that on a cross-border basis is the way we bring them to heel, is the way we make them pay a fair share. And that's why we do it.
Chukwuemeka, thank you. We're just coming to the final few moments, and I'm going to ask each of the panel, and it's going to be a brutal 30 seconds. David Cameron talks about rolling the dice. I want you to ask in 30 seconds what you think will happen on the 23rd of June. Before we do, we've talked about a lot of the big personalities in this country, David Cameron, Tony Blair, Michael Gove and others. One we haven't touched on, Nigel Farage, is Boris Johnson. Now, many Brexit supporters would say that you and Boris Johnson are the Jamie Vardy and Harry Kane of the campaign, but they don't play the two of you together.
But I will, within reason, work with anybody on the right, centre or left of British politics to bring back the ability to run our own affairs and be the masters of our own destiny. And Nick, the reason I'm doing this, there are 183 countries in the world that celebrate Independence Days. They have their own parliaments, they make their own laws, they control their own borders. All I want on June the 23rd is for Britain to become the 184th. Wouldn't that be lovely?
But if doing that, Boris Johnson could help you, why don't the two of you get together? Where is the stumbling block? Where's the bump in the road? What's happened to the bromance?
The official Leave campaign don't want anything to do with me or most of UKIP, and that's very sad. I think we'd have been better and stronger if we'd all worked together, but that's the way that it is. I think between now and June 23rd, you will see it coming together. I hope so.
I agree.
We come to the 30 seconds, and I'm afraid, panel, it is going to have to be a fairly brutal 30 seconds. David Cameron says we're rolling the dice on the 23rd of June. In 30 seconds, what do you think is going to happen? Is it rolling the dice, and what is going to happen on June the 23rd, even Siobhan?
I have no idea, but I hope that everybody goes out and uses their vote. And I hope that they're clear that all the things that you've been promised, if we leave Europe, that immigration will get sorted, that the NHS will be fine, that everybody will have the job they desire, is a complete load of nonsense. And just as you stand at that ballot box, are you going to risk your home, your job and your kids' future? I just think it's not a risk worth taking.
Natural broadcaster, 30 seconds, thank you. Jacob Rees-Mogg.
The choice for people on the 23rd of June is their country Europe or is their country the United Kingdom? Is it a bureaucratic, run by the Commission, inefficient, failed state of Europe, or is it a democratic, free United Kingdom where their vote can change the government and change the law?
Jacob, thank you. Richard Reid.
Well, I'm a Yorkshireman, I'm a Londoner, I'm a great British citizen, and I'm also a European. They are not conflicting identities. We can be all of these things. Europe is the best and biggest opportunities there is in the world. We've got the best deal that you could possibly imagine. We get free access to it. We haven't had to take the euro. We haven't had to take the Schengen. We will not get a deal as good as this. I am not saying it's all doom and gloom if we come out. It just won't be as good. Why we would vote for that, it doesn't make sense.
Thank you for that. Kate Hope.
I think people on June the 23rd will vote with their instinct, with a feeling of what they want the destiny of their country to be. And I hope that they will look at what we have become within the European Union and actually become more positive about our future outside what are shackles of the European Union. And I believe very strongly that this will be a decision taken by people out there who are not particularly interested in politics, who've not joined a political party, who are just people who are fed up being told by unelected bureaucrats in Brussels what they can do and what they can't do. And this is their opportunity to have payback to all the elite and all the establishment who've gone along with this for years and given them no chance.
Thank you. Kate, thank you. Chika, Amuna.
Well, look, I'd invite people to adopt a big vision of who we are and what we can achieve as a people. I think we should be self-confident. I don't buy this tripe that says we get trampled over whenever we want to get things done in the European Union. Far from it. We provide leadership. People follow where we go. Let's stay big, let's stay strong, and let's not rob the next generation, who ultimately, that's who this is about. Let's not rob them of their futures. Let's not diminish our country. Let's stay things in the world, promoting our values and promoting prosperity, not just here, but for everyone.
Thank you, Mr. Noonan. Nigel Farage.
This time last week, I would have agreed. I didn't have a clue who was going to win. This was the week that changed the referendum, in my opinion, to see significant figures getting on to the main issue. Frank Field, I saw last night on Question Time, he was tremendous. We've seen Boris Johnson, Michael Gove, people realising, major political figures, now realising that the only way we can solve the number one problem in British politics, namely excessive immigration into our country, is to vote for Brexit. And now there are lots of voices out there saying it. I have absolutely no doubt now Brexit will win, which is why I went to Ladbrokes yesterday and put my money on.
All right.
It's still 5-2. It's a very good price.
Well, that's interesting. Chuka Umunna, are you going to put a bet on a Remain?
I think I should.
Were you going to put a bet on a Remain?
I think I should.
How much are you going to put down? He put £1,000.
I'm not sure I've got his money, but I'll put something.
Finally.
You wouldn't afterwards.
Finally, when the dust has settled and we've voted...
We'll see, won't we?
We voted
We'll see.
Remain, thank God some harmony's broken out, to remain or leave. Will David Cameron remain or leave at number 10? So along the panel, it's simple this, remain or leave. Will David Cameron, after June the 23rd, remain or leave inside number 10? Richard Reid, can I start with you? We'll come along the panel this way. After June 23rd, it's a one-way answer, if you would, Richard Reid, for David Cameron. Remain or leave?
Yes, of course. This is not politics. This is about the country. Don't confuse it. Remain.
Siobhan?
He wants to go.
Leave. Chuka?
I don't care.
Nigel Farage?
Leave.
Kate Hoey?
Leave. He can't negotiate for us.
Jacob
Remain.
Remain. Thank you.
How loyal.
God save the Prime Minister.
For this Express EU debate. Let the applause ring out for, in no particular order, Kate Hoey, Siobhan McDonough, Chuka Umunna, Jacob Rees-Mogg, Richard Reid and Nigel Farage. Thank you to the audience. Thank you for watching on express.co.uk. Keep reading the Daily Express, the Sunday Express, the Daily Star and the Star on Sunday for everything you need to know. Hopefully, we've decided, help you decide which way your vote is going. And of course, you can follow everything at express.co.uk. The vote takes place, as if we need to remind you, on Thursday, the 23rd of June. If you care about what happens to Britain, you must vote and follow, of course, all the information in the Express title. So from the Northern Shell Building in London and from my panel, I'm Nick Ferrari. Thank you for watching and good night.
make this something that Parliament debates, that Parliament decides on, so that at general elections, every MP is accountable to their constituents for how they've spoken and how they voted on the immigration issue.
All right, thank you for that. Remember, if you want to get around, absolutely, have your applause, or if you think otherwise. More on that side in a moment. Chuka, you're an MP for an inner part of London, which will feel pressure on schools, on hospitals, on housing and everything. There must be something to what Nigel Farage is saying, surely.
Well, it's a myth to suggest that all these problems that we have in our country, whether it's school places, NHS funding, housing, is down to the fact that we have all these immigrants taking these places. It's a very convenient dumping ground of blame for domestic governments of all political persuasions. Look, the reason that people cannot get on the housing ladder in my constituency, and in the SW16 postcode, we've seen house prices go up by over 20% year on year for the last 2 to 3 years, is because we haven't built enough homes. We've got the lowest rate of new build since the 1920s. And the reason that we have a problem with school places and teacher shortages is because you haven't seen enough investment in our schools and you haven't seen enough teachers being trained. Now, it's very convenient to say that's all the fault of these immigrant children, but no, it isn't. It's actually the fault of the government here. And in respect of this, can I just touch on the Australian points system, by the way? Because one of the really important things for people who are listening to this here and on camera to remember is that actually we have slightly more people coming here from outside the EU than from in the EU. Now, we already have a point system that applies to people coming in from outside the EU, but we are still getting more of those in than we are coming from in the EU. And let's not forget to look at the other side of the coin on this. We've got 2 million Brits living and working in the European Union and enjoying the free movement that brings. Yes, we have. We've got 1.5 million people employed in EU citizens-owned businesses here, and we've got over 100,000 EU citizens helping us run the very public services that you're talking about.
Let's get the numbers right. There are 1 million British people who have holiday homes in Europe. You know, people like my father who spends February in Spain. They don't count. So there are 1 million.
I said living and working. I said living and working. 1.2 million living, and when you include people who work, it's 2 million.
A third of that million.
It's 2 million.
A third of that million are in Ireland, with whom we've had an open border for 100 years because of our historical links. And of the 750,000 who are living, they're mostly on the Costa del Sol or in the west of France, and the vast majority of them actually are retired and spending their money. So the idea that 2 million of us are living and working in Europe simply is not true.
It's 1.9. Let's get the facts straight. You can go and check this online. People watching this online, go and Google it on Fact Check. There are 1.2 million people, yes, living in the EU. When you take into account people who are living and working there, it is 2 million. That is the figure.
All right. Let's not get too hung up on figures. Let's bring Kate. Kate, I heard you muttering and getting quite angry. You're on the Labour side, if you will, although you're sitting on the right, my right hand. What about this suggestion of the number of houses that need to be built and successive failures by governments of all different colour?
Well, I think, Chuka's right that there's not been enough housing built, but that's a kind of different argument from what we're here today to discuss, because for me, there is absolutely no sense in us, unlike any other country in the world, apart from those that are in the EU, not being able to control your own borders. And the reality is we can't, because anyone who's part of the European Union can come in. And therefore, I want to see some planning going into the fact of we can't plan when we don't know how many people there are going to be.
Kate Hoey, just respond to Siobhan McDonough.
Well, I didn't hear you.
There is no country in the world that controls its own borders absolutely. Look at Donald Trump wanting to build a wall against Mexico.
Hang on. There's all about illegal immigration. We're talking about people who can come by right because they have got a European Union passport. And that, to me, is doing down particularly countries in the Commonwealth that we have a huge past historical relationship with, that I would love to see more people coming from. No one. And it's this sort of media, I'm not going to blame the media because we're here in a newspaper.
No, don't worry.
There is this argument always that anyone who's against the EU is somehow against immigration. We all know that immigration is going to happen and is needed. It's the kind of immigration, the people we want with skills. The Australian point system, to me, seems a really common sense, sensible approach to how we control the numbers. It's so obvious.
But hang on, if you would.
This is industry. A round of applause, please, for Siobhan. Completing the Remain lineup, Richard Reid. Now, Richard is the co-founder of Innocent Drinks and Jam Jar Investments. He's the deputy chairman of the Britain Stronger in Europe campaign. Richard says he fears the UK's GDP would shrink if we were to quit the EU. A round of applause for Richard as well. And to my right, Nigel Farage. Well, if he wins the bet you read about in the Daily Express today, he'll be a rich man. He's been the leader of UKIP since 2010. Prior to that, from 2006 to 2009. He's also been an MEP since 1999. Before politics, he worked as a commodity broker. Nigel's been campaigning for the Brexit for decades. He argues particularly in favour of greater border controls. Let's hear it for Mr Farage, please. To his right, the proverbial rose, possibly between two, I'll let you finish that sentence, is Kate Hoey. Now, Kate's been the Labour MP for Vauxhall since 1989. She served as Minister for Sport under the Tony Blair government. She maintains that Euroscepticism is traditionally a left-wing movement and will vote to leave due to the crippling effect, she says, the EU has on this country. Let's hear it for Kate. And to complete the lineup, Jacob Rees-Mogg has been the Conservative MP for North East Somerset since 2010. Now, prior to politics, he worked in the City of London and he founded Somerset Capital Management. Jacob is primarily concerned by Britain's lack of sovereignty due to EU law. A round of applause, please, for the last member of our panel. As you are watching this, you can take part, and please do, online using the hashtag #ExpressEUDebate, and I'll share some of your thoughts, views and feelings with you during the course of our conversation. Now, let's start with a subject that's rarely off the front pages and really got some added attention from last night from the Prime Minister's appearance. It's immigration. Total net migration to the UK is running at over 300,000 a year, despite the government failing to hit its target of tens of thousands. Now, around half of the immigrants coming to the UK are from outside the EU. EU citizens have the right to live and work in any member state. They work here, they live here, they pay taxes here. Therefore, migrants are entitled to make use of our public services, our hospitals, our schools, our housing, etc. So if we start with you, Nigel Farage, they live here, they work here, they pay taxes here. What's the problem?
The problem is we had immigration post-war for 60 years, running at about a net 30,000 a year. It was a number that we could live with, a number that we could accept, a number that did not put exceptional strain on our public services, and a number within which government could plan for the future. What did we do in 2004? Mr Blair opened the door to 8 and then 10 former communist countries, and we now have no control over the numbers that are coming. So we can't plan or provide for our public services, and we've got to a point now where the sheer numbers of people coming are putting intolerable strains on our public services, have driven down wages for ordinary workers. And if I just pick out one little issue just to sort of explain how tough this is, very few young people can now get on the housing ladder. They can't aspire to what their parents or grandparents had. The pressure is massive, and the population pressure is massive. We now have to build a new house, one new house every 4 minutes in this country, just to cope with current levels of immigration.
So how would coming out of the EU change that, Mr Farage?
Because at the moment we have no control, and this is where the Prime Minister got into big trouble last night. He's trying to maintain that we can control immigration numbers as members of the European Union, and we can't, because that, which ought to be a British passport, the first two words on it are European Union, and 508 million people have got one of those, and any of them can come. I want us to have a positive immigration policy. I want us to have one that says to people from all over the world, you've got skills to bring, you haven't got a criminal record, you bring your own health insurance, we're very happy to have you, but in sensible numbers. We can only do that by voting for Brexit.
And this is the Australian points system, briefly, is it?
Well, that's what they do. The Australians...
But that would lead to more people. One of the architects of the Australian points system says it would get more people into this country.
Australia is a continent, that wants more people, but they're very selective about who they have. The thing about a points system is we can choose. But what I think, post-Brexit we should do is we should actually...
On June 23rd, you get to decide the UK's future in Europe. Will you vote to remain in the EU or leave? For the next 60 minutes, I'll present the issues facing both sides of the argument to a panel of invited guests and a live studio audience. I'm Nick Ferrari. Welcome to the Express EU debate. Hello and welcome to the Northern and Shell building in London, home to Express newspapers and the venue for this Express EU debate. So here we are, just 20 days away from the most important decision facing the nation in decades. On the face of it, it is a simple choice. Do you want to remain in the European Union or leave? Business as usual or a Brexit? The polls for in and out are neck and neck, but many of you are undecided and turning regularly to the pages of the Daily Express, the Sunday Express, the Daily Star and the Star on Sunday for all the information you need. But here for the next 60 minutes, let's look at some of the major issues surrounding this historic referendum and how they affect you. Our live audience is made up of an equal number of Remain, of Leave and Don't Knows. To help you make up your mind, or possibly change it, let's welcome our Express EU debate panel. To the Remain side, Chuka Umunna has been the Labour MP for Streatham since 2012. He was Shadow Secretary of State for Business, Innovation and Skills from 2011 until 2015, and he entered the Labour Party leadership race in 2015 but later withdrew his candidacy. He's argued the benefits of free trade are one of the advantages of the UK staying in the EU. Let's hear it for Chuka, please, ladies and gentlemen. To Chuka's left, Siobhan McDonough has been the Labour MP for Mitcham and Morden since 1997. She's also a former Assistant Whip for the Labour Party. She's voting to remain in the EU to protect our trade relationship and our financial services.